Hey there, and welcome to YAS, a stripper podcast. On this podcast, we'll discuss how classifying each other as people and workers is dangerous to society and marginalized groups of people. We'll also talk about the climate in and outside of the strip clubs and all of the amazing things that strippers do. And of course, we'll talk about all of the things in between. I'm your queen, A.M. Davies, and this is YAS, a stripper podcast. Hello, dears. Welcome to YAS, a stripper podcast. This is AMD, aka the queen of motherfucking sexy. Okay, so this episode is about pole history, and that pole dancing derives from stripping. So just to give you a little idea about our guest for today, her name is Crimson Minx, and she is someone who I have worked with over the last several years in researching the history of pole dance and how it derives from stripping, and that pole dancing was invented by strippers, etc. So yeah, this is a really important episode. We're going to debunk some narratives, and we're also going to ask you, the listener, what do you know that we don't know? Because, surprise, a lot of history of sex work was not documented, and not to the extent that we would like. So we need help in filling in some holes, but also we filled in a lot of holes from reading books and visiting museums. So you're going to find out a lot more, and Crimson is so thorough and such a joy to work with. We are quite a team. So we literally will be breaking down the history starting from the early 1920s up until the early 2000s. And we covered so much, but not enough. And we're considering doing a two-parter. And just to let you know, all of this research and information has been culminated as a result of me and one of my business partners trying to do a documentary on all of this. And long story short, we ran out of money. It's really hard to get a documentary fundraised. My business partner went through a career change. I ended up having an accident. I went through a career change, then COVID hit. But I will honestly say that I'm very grateful that we never finished this documentary, because so many things have changed since we started doing this research, doing the interviews, and doing this documentary. We started in 2014, and so much has changed that I would probably be really upset with the content that I would have put out 2 years, even a year ago, because my outlook and the world's outlook and all of the things that are happening around us are so different than they were in 2014. And so I'm really grateful that we've had the time to let everything simmer, because now we can really get down to the nitty gritty, because so many things have come to the surface, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful to be released from the whorephobia that plagued me for so many years, because that whorephobia definitely contributed to the way that we were trying to tell the story, the history, and trying how it was dictating the narrative of the documentary. I was staying true to the origins of pole dancing via stripping, but I still had elements of whorephobia lingering, and I acknowledge that in the larger part of this podcast. So I will ramble no further and let you just get right to the heart of this show, of this particular episode. I'm so excited for you to listen. And please write in with your thoughts and any information that you have on the subjects that we cover. Enjoy yourselves. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of YAS, a Stripper podcast. Today's episode is going to be a little different. Today's guest is not a stripper, but she's definitely a stripper ally. Hi, Crimson. How are you?
Hi, Emery. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. So, I just need to explain to the audience why this episode is special. So, Crimson and I have been working together since, when would you say I came to you, or that we started talking about the history of pole dancing?
Probably 2000 and maybe 15.
Yeah, probably.
2014, 2015, I think.
Yeah, because 2014 was when I started this project called Fistful of Steel, which was meant to be a history of pole dancing starting from like the 1920s and how pole dancing derived from stripping. So 2014 was a long time ago. It was like, it feels like it was 20 years ago. Things are
Does.
vastly different. Wouldn't you agree?
It's a
Things
different world.
such a different world. I don't know about you, but I'm a very different person as well. I've evolved a lot as a human being.
Yeah,
Do you
same,
have a
same.
similar sentiment, or are you
Oh,
just like
yes.
cruising?
If it's been 6 years and you haven't evolved as a human, what are you doing with your life, especially in these times? So yes, for sure. And I feel like
Yeah.
that's the point of this all, to grow and to, as we learn new things and to
Yeah.
evolve ourselves. So it's fun to come back, and because we haven't chatted on this in a few years, so it's fun to
Right.
come back and jump back on that horse.
Yeah. And so I want to be really authentic and fully transparent with our audience in that, when I originally was working on this project and I started to bring it to other people, I was deep in my whorephobia. I was really, I didn't know that I was plagued with whorephobia. And my goal was to not only tell the history of pole dancing and that it derives from strippers, because I always acknowledge that. I myself was a stripper, obviously, still am. But my other goal was to really define the difference between the two, like in this effort to sort of save the well-being of the pole dance industry. And I look back on that and I realize how damaging that mentality was. And I'm very grateful to have grown and come out of that. But I just want to be really straight up with everyone. I don't want to sit here and sugarcoat and pretend that all of my intentions were good for all, because they weren't. And so, yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that. Because you remember in the beginning when I was like, this isn't a stripper pole, it's a pole. Why are you calling it a stripper pole? And now I'm like, oh no, honey, you better, like, no, that is a stripper pole and you are a civilian on a stripper pole. And so I've just kind of done this 180. Is that something that you've noticed at all in the narrative?
In your narrative,
Yeah.
I you know what, have not actually. I felt like you were always very authentically like wanting to share the real story,
Yeah.
and there was never this denial of where it came from. So I think I maybe missed that first part. So
Right. So not a denial of where it came from, but um more like it was really important to me to define the difference. And I
okay.
and I think my intentions were, I didn't have I had good intentions, but they weren't helpful.
I think you always had great intentions. I'm going to say
Well,
that
thank
about
you
you.
so much. Thank you, Crimson, for being a wonderful fan. But I just feel like I have to say that for the record. If anybody sees any past trailers or anything, I just really wanted to make that clear. But we're here, we're on the right path, and we're here to talk about the history of pole dancing and how pole dancing itself was created by strippers, popularized by strippers, and pioneered specifically in Los Angeles, and also to get to the bottom of other information that we might be missing. But pole dancers, strippers, black strippers specifically in Los Angeles, were the pioneers of the type of pole dancing that we see now. And so we're going to uncover all of these past things that a lot of people don't know about. We're going to debunk some narratives that you all believe in currently. And Crimson and I have been holding on to this information because we wanted to put it in this documentary. And now we're not sure what's happening with the documentary. So we're just trying to get some information out. So are you ready to dive into this with me, Crimson?
I'm ready. I'm ready to learn some
Okay.
new research that you have as well. So
Perfect. Yes. So I kind of want, do you want to talk about the 1920s or do you want me to do
sure.
that? Yeah.
I can talk about,
I
yeah,
would I
sure.
would love to
So
hear your voice. Yeah.
the reason why, and people say, why is this relevant? And we'll link to it. We'll link to it in a little bit, and you'll understand why we're bringing it up. But back in the turn of the 20th century, there were traveling circuses and carnivals, and with these, there were these hoochie coochie tents, the girly shows. And these were the shows where essentially men would go to see women gyrate and dance sexy on a stage. And the way that a tent is structured is that there's a pole in the center holding it up with the top of the tent draped down and then sides. And so the stage was always in the center with the chairs around.
Right.
And so because of that, there was a pole in the middle of the stage. And so this is where we first hear of sexy dancing on a pole. And the fact is, it wasn't an intentional thing. It was just that the pole was there in the center of the tent. And as these women were dancing, they started incorporating it into their dance. They were, jumping on it and gyrating on it and grinding on it. And in some instances, they just needed to lean on it because they were inebriated and just needed something to hold them up while they were on stage. So that is, yeah.
Been there and done that.
Yeah. So Emery and I are going to tell you all of the truths that we've come across, and that is a reality of it as well. So it wasn't just, this pure, we were essentially dancing on this pole and having this connection. It was more of a utilitarian type of, it's there, let's use it type situation at the time.
Right. And so one of the names of the pole used to be called the Snorting Poll, which I hate that name. Right. But tell everyone why it was called a snorting pole.
You have to remind me of that.
Okay, I'll tell you.
People would snort, like, yes. I think the men were snorting in the crowd.
Correct. So when the women would grind on the pole in a sexual manner because they figured out like that was hot, then the men in the audience would snort like pigs. And so that action created a reaction. And so then the pole became known as the Snorting Poll. For how long, we're not sure, but that did start in the 1920s. Yeah. So one of the things that I find really interesting about this story about the girly tents is that there are only white women told in this story. They don't highlight any Black female bodies in the story of these tents. And looking back on this history lately, I've been really questioning that and thinking, well, that's because they erase Black history in general. And so there sadly is no information on that, but I don't doubt
I will actually jump in there. I took a trip down to the International Showmen's Museum in Florida. Mm-hmm. If you remember that.
I do remember.
Yes, there's this great museum. It's called the International Showmen's Museum. It's all about the traveling carnival back in the golden age. And there were tents with women. They were segregated. So there were,
of course.
That was the law back then. So they did also have the girly shows. They did have, Black women had girly shows just as the white women did. So they were both represented at the carnivals, but it was a time of segregation. And so,
right.
Yeah.
But.
And at the Showman Museum, they do have a whole section on it, which is awesome. So if anyone can make it there to see.
Right. Is the Showman Museum, is that run and created by sex workers?
No, it's by Carnies. It's a Carney museum. So
okay.
Yes. It's right outside of Gibbstown. I believe that's the name, which is a really famous carny town in Florida.
Okay.
And it's not just about that. So the entire museum, it has everything about carnival. So it has like the freak shows, it has the circus but it also is very inclusive, where it does have the girly shows and the hoochie coochie shows. So it includes everything that you would find in a traveling carnival back in the early 20th century. And
right. But online, in books, like, you got to travel to a carny town in Florida to get the truth. I mean, come on,
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of my point. And we're going to get into that later. But also, like you said earlier, the hoochie coochie dancers, that was originally, first of all, I hate that they were called that. I find that to be demeaning and rude. And they were Egyptians. They were Egyptian women that came over specifically to be featured at the World's Fair in Chicago. Right.
There was an exoticism about them. So fetishization, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah. And unfortunately, what we're learning as well from brown sex workers it's that they see the word and feel the word exotic is actually pretty racist. So I just wanted to acknowledge that for those that are affected by that word. But yeah, they and one of the things that I was always fascinated about is that we got floor work dancing from the belly dancers. Is this something that, because I read this in a book about history of dance. Have you heard of this?
I would assume that it was a part of it.
Yeah, because they would slither around on the floor, and that's what we do now. So that was all developed by Egyptian dancers that came over here. And thank you, Egyptian belly dancers, for giving us floor fuckery.
Well, if you go back to the ancient temples, the temple priestesses back in, back in the day, sensual movement was an essential part of that
Right.
back then. So,
Mhm.
it's part of the feminine, right? It's part of
Right.
the feminine energy wants to move and wants to writhe and roll. And so yeah, it goes way before the 20th century, right? This is
Right.
back in the historic days when the temple priestesses moved their bodies like that.
Right.
And I'm sure if
Exactly.
there was a pole there, they would be slithering on it as well.
I mean, why not? It's really convenient to hold on to it and grind on it. It's really convenient. And also, I just want to say, like, this is why I love working with you on this project because, like, I feel like we both have knowledge from different areas. And thank you for, like, correcting me. And I also want to say that, like, to anybody who's listening, there's a lot of holes in our research because there's just not a lot of information out there. And so if you know anything, or you have a grandmother or a great grandmother that taught you something, like we would love to hear it and for you to help contribute to this history that we're trying to tell because there's just not an awful lot. And as you see, we have to go to Florida to get full stories. So if you have information, please reach out and let us know.
Yeah, when we spoke before doing this podcast, it was with the intention that we want to share the information that's out there. It seems really counterproductive to everyone to keep researching the same stuff that's out there. So we've gone pretty deep. So we're here to present what we have found out there, and then with the call to then, if you know more, we're not saying we know it all. So
Right.
please, please, please let us know, because this is something worth recording.
Right. Absolutely. So, okay. So moving on, um, we're looking at what happened in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I'm
Yeah.
looking at your notes. It says, during
There
the
was,
world, huh?
yeah, I can sum it up if you
Yeah, do
want.
it, please. You're the
Yeah.
queen. You
No,
got it.
you're the queen. There was a depression, there were two world wars, and so the traveling carnival just kind of ceased. That was an end to a lot of people's career in the traveling carnival. People were away at war, people didn't have money for entertainment. And so that is kind of the era where the traveling shows kind of ceased. And then in the 50s, post World War II and that time, what we saw was that the strip shows started to emerge within bars, hence the name strip club. But it was very different from what we have today. What we would see back in the 50s was more as what we would now say is burlesque. So there was a stage act, there was a live band, couples would go and watch this together, but it was the art of the tease, right? So as we're familiar with burlesque, that was a great time, an emergence within like clubs, bars itself, as opposed to like traveling. But all of these acts had costuming, they had props, they had, like I said, the live band. It was very different from, things evolved, things change. But so that's kind of like the stripper back then is what we would perceive as burlesque.
So do you suppose like that was the birth of burlesque and then strippers and burlesque, like then there was like a branch off of strippers that kind of
I
diverged from burlesque?
I actually, the way I view it, I'm not saying this is the right way, but I see us burlesque and strippers sharing, being synonymous and sharing back to the the girly shows. You know, I do see us sharing a very similar history until you see, and we'll get into it, it was about the 70s where you see the split.
Okay. Well, I mean, I feel like we're there, right? Is there anything? Yeah. So what happened with this split in the 70s?
What happened was the women's liberation movement, which is a great thing, you know?
Right.
And so this is kind of where really things get interesting.
Okay.
And this is where, when you read the history, you have some of the more classic strippers, burlesque dancers, like Blaze Star or Tempest Storm. This is where you see them on record saying, like, it's a new thing now, and it's just not what we used to do. It was almost like a new team came in, right? Because they were used to having, they were not used to stripping nude. They were not used to, it was a mixed audience in terms of like men and women would come see them. And what happened in the 70s is that with the women's liberation movement, there was women wanting to, you know, be more liberated. So there was more nudity involved. And when that mixed with just the times, right? The stage act changed. The band disappeared. So it was just pre-recorded music. The costuming and the props were not so much a thing. It was full nudity in a lot of places. Specifically, Vancouver is where my research has taken that all of this really did begin. Was in Vancouver. And there, in the 70s, there was things called spreading. There was the stage showers, all of those things. That starts emerging 70s, and it's just a different world, right? So also, I would love to call out, if anybody is really interested in this, this book, Burlesque West, and I think you may have read it too.
Yes.
By Becky Ross, is really interesting. It's so much happened in Vancouver, Canada, in terms of the strip club and the emergence of pole.
Wow.
Yes.
Vancouver.
And so, yes. And the reason being, they had very loose liquor laws. They were a port town where there was, you know, people coming and going. The business owners were kind of entrepreneurial, and these club owners realized we can have stage shows going around the clock, whereas in some places you can't be serving booze in the afternoon. They had it was a town that was, let's say, there was underground kind of running the show. There was corrupt police, all of that. So you could get away with, it was like a Sin City type thing, you know?
Okay. Sounds fun.
And I know, right? And so, you know, a lot, you were just allowed to get away with so much.
Sure.
There were, in the United States, you could not be fully nude yet at this point. You could in Vancouver. You could go full nude. You could have these shows around the clock, and they realized that they could make some good money off of this. So this is when the dancers, the strippers, started going to Vancouver, and that's when they were getting, like, because they could make the most money there.
Of course. Yeah. So before we like really dive into the 70s, something happened in 1968 in Oregon that we are just stumped on, right?
Yes, this is something Wikipedia says. If anyone looks up pole dance on Wikipedia, it says that someone named Belle Jangles is credited as the first person to dance on a pole in Oregon in a club called Mugwumps or something like that.
Right.
And the fact is, no one has ever been able to find a citation for that. So where that came from, no one knows.
We don't know.
Do you know? Are you a listener that knows?
Right. And Belle Jangles is cited as being a black dancer, right?
That's awesome. I don't know.
I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure. But again, like you said, the information is so limited. I have read that. And because what happens is like a lot of these pole dance websites, like older pole dance websites like blogs and things like that, and some studios try to tell the history of pole dance, and they like basically copy and paste from Wikipedia and from these same sources like you mentioned. And so it's just like this same basic one-liner, and there's no other evidence to back it up. So we're stumped on this Bell Jangles Mugwump Oregon stripper that pole danced on record for the first time in a club. So if you know more, please let us know.
Yeah,
Because
I
we are
mean,
stumped.
I've talked to a lot of people that are like have tried to cite that source, and no one knows, and you can't find anything on the club. But that doesn't mean it's not accurate. It just means like we don't know anything about it. But
Right.
it's only fair to say that's what Wikipedia says, so we got to share that. But we can say that we have no idea what that means or who
Right.
that is or really what the situation was behind that.
Right. Yeah. I would love to know more about that. So going back to the 70s then, it looks like that you had mentioned, okay, here we go. The Number 5 Orange and the Wild Duck Hotels. Can you fill us in on what that's about?
Yes, definitely. And so what happened through the 70s and then into the 80s in Vancouver is that it was really like a strip club, like capital. Like people would go there and it was just a known city where, stripping thrived. And so these club owners were taking advantage of it. They were investing money in sound systems and stages and lighting. And it's worth noting that the way that strip clubs work in Canada are different than how they work in the US and what maybe some contemporary strippers may be used to. So this would be a good time to share how in Canada, and I'm not sure if it's still the case, but at least up until the 2000s, dancers have agents and the agents get them booked at different clubs, as opposed to I work at this one club and I get this shift. It was the agent and they would take like a maybe 12 to 15% cut, but the club would pay the performer to come and they would get X amount of money based on their draw.
Right. So they would get paid to be on stage and probably plus make tips as well.
Yeah, I don't know about the tips, but maybe not. I don't want to say anything that I'm not clear on.
At least in the 90s, that's what was happening. They were getting paid. So I don't know if it evolved. They were getting paid and tipped. So what we do know is what stripping has evolved into was originally strippers were getting paid to show up to work. And now strippers pay hundreds of dollars to show up to work. So it's like the opposite of what it once
Yeah.
was. Yeah.
It's interesting. And I know that when you were stripping in the US, you didn't have an agent, but strippers in Canada at that time did have agents.
Correct. But I did have an agent once when I won Entertainer of the Year for 2006 for Spearmint Rhino. And then I did, I'm pretty sure I had to give them a cut of what I was getting paid. I don't remember what that was. And at the time, I didn't question it because I was so used to everyone's hands being in my pockets. It was just, I was conditioned to believe that if I wanted to have this great opportunity, I had to pay for it. Um, so
we can definitely jump back into that because that definitely comes up later. So about the spread of pole dance. So
yeah.
But to wrap up how the poles ended up in the studios, because up to this point, the 50s, the 60s, what we had talked about, there were not poles in the strip clubs. So this is, and I have heard actually someone say 1987 was the year that the first pole was installed in a strip club in Canada. And we just found different information. The information we found that was, and I will read this, in the late 1970s, the Number 5 Orange and the Wild Duck hotels were among the first to install brass poles on stage. debuting under the canvas big top on fairgrounds decades earlier, the pole reappeared in California as an offshoot of Club Wonder's desire to market something novel. So essentially what happened was, as they're building up these strip clubs and they're creating these amazing experiences, someone was like, let's put a brass pole on the stage as a nod to those tents, the girly shows that we talked about earlier. And that's why that was important, is because someone was just like, that was cool. They were aware and they just thought it was a novel thing to add to their stages. And because a lot of stripper history is in the Pacific Northwest of America. And that is because American dancers would go up to Vancouver to dance, but they could only get work permits for 6 months. So then they would just go back down to Washington, to Oregon, to California, before making their way back up when they could get their visas again, because they were making so much money. And so it makes sense that like a California club would be like, oh, I heard they're doing that in these clubs in Vancouver. And that's kind of how that ended up spreading. But it was initially, according to this book, then it was these two hotels, the Number 5 Orange and the Wild Duck Hotels, who were owned by our friends that we have to talk about. They own different hotels. So excuse me, but that was what we found in our research. That was in the late 1970s. It was those two hotels that were the first to install, among the first to install brass poles on stage. And
so it's interesting. It's interesting that you're saying hotels. So these hotels had strip clubs within them.
Yes. And so here's the thing. There were two gentlemen named Jack Cooney and Darcy Taylor, and they owned the Drake and the Mar hotels. Okay. And so they, again, are entrepreneurs, and hotels were the place where these strip clubs were housed. It was in a lot of hotels as well as independent clubs.
Right.
But it was all of these locations in Vancouver were really like what we know as strip clubs started to emerge. And so it was these two gentlemen that we had uncovered, actually, because they wanted their girls to be good. Like, they were known for, like, you would get in trouble if you smoked pot backstage. You were in trouble if you were late. Like, they ran it, like, you're showing up. This is like,
well, they treated them as employees. They paid them as employees. It was a job. Yeah.
And so what they did was they created this a studio. Now it was just for their dancers, but to come and to learn to dance on the pole, to learn choreography, to learn floor work. And for Anne Marie and I, this is the first instance, and we found that it happened in 1984. Now, it was not to the general public, and that's worth mentioning. It was for strippers.
Right. So this is like earth-shattering to the pole dance community's belief that the pole dancing that we know today comes from Malakam, which, if you don't know what Malakam is, it's young Indian men doing gymnastics style moves on like a tree trunk size wooden pole, or that it comes from Chinese pole, which was also practiced by young men on very tall, very thick rubber poles. And this all took place in the 1500s, in the 16th century, I believe. And so, yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that this first pole dance studio was open to strippers only, so strippers could improve their skill.
And they're strippers.
Yeah.
They're employees,
Exactly. Yeah.
So it was kind of like them investing in their talent, right? So we're going to give them a way to become better, because they were really, they wanted to be known as having the best dancers in town,
Right.
It's a really different and interesting situation of how all of this emerged, because well, are we okay moving on?
Oh yeah. It's so funny. I know all of this and I'm still like enthralled and fascinated.
Yeah. Because here's the cool thing, is that because this is continuing, let me say, I want to make sure that I'm not. Yeah. So So here's the thing, let's transition. So now that we have the 70s and we realize how it's a different style, it's not so much the live band, the costuming, the props. It does get more kind of, I don't want to say crude, but it gets very in your face. There's showering on stage, there's spreading, which was a big thing. It's full nude. It was but it was still, I want to say that's in comparison to what maybe we saw in the 50s and 60s. But even when you speak to strippers through the 2000s, there was still showmanship. There was still beautiful costumes. It just wasn't it was like a beautiful maybe bikini, as opposed to we're stripping down 10 layers type thing.
Right.
Gloves and all. But there was still always in Vancouver and a focus on the show womanship, we can say. But the reason is because of these agents, right? And so all of these different kind of Miss Nude competitions and all of those that you're familiar with started emerging. And what would happen is these agents, they were the judges, and we can bring this into the 80s now.
Okay.
And that's where they would find new talent. And so you would get signed by these agents. And the thing is, the agents would send you around. So maybe to all these different districts in Canada, but they were also known, they'll send you to Japan, they'll send you to Greece, they'll send you to London. And so it was kind of like this, you weren't necessarily an independent contractor where you had to find your own work. You had an agent, just like a band would have an agent, right? So if you're a band and you're signed and you have an agent, they get a cut because they're getting you concerts, places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And that is like what you said, the business model now of you musicians and artists and the like. And I'm just like sitting here thinking like how did we go backwards?
Well, it's interesting
We
because
went backwards.
well, and it is a Canadian thing though,
Okay.
because when that was happening in Canada, it wasn't necessarily happening here. And that's why through my research, I have started to realize, and it's even like, if you look at Toronto, it was a lot less tolerant than say Vancouver at the time. Vancouver really did seem to just have that perfect circumstances of the liquor laws and the corrupt police and the port being a port city, we're having people come and go that just allowed for these around the clock strip clubs, and where the talent were the strippers, and so this is where say coming into the 80s and 90s now, we find that a lot of these agents would hire other dancers to teach their new talent. So okay, they found this new talent, but they're not really good at maybe like engaging the audience or choreo or some pole. So the agents would pay some more seasoned strippers, and they would use the club off hours to teach them some skills before the agent then sent that new scout out. And so the strippers were teaching other strippers in the clubs wherever, and so they're in this town this day. Okay, the agent's like, we have some new girls, we want to teach you here. And so they were using the clubs after hours to buy, and the agents were paying for it. But again, this was in Canada.
Yeah, I again, I'm like, how did we go backwards? Because when I started stripping, like there was nobody helping each other. We weren't doing that. And when we were showing each other tricks, it was like, look at what I can do. Like I have very vivid memories of like, look what I can do, but not necessarily here's how you do it in spotting. Like it was a lot of just learning on our own. And there was nobody in a supervisor position that was like, oh, let us help you learn so that you don't get like eaten alive. It's a crazy industry, and if you don't have guidance, you could affect your mental health. It's because it's totally different from a normal civilian life, and these days, at least when I started, there was nobody teaching.
Well, and there's also the difference, right? It wasn't the dancer was going out and paying the other dancer. It was the agent was going out and paying the dancer. And so would you like me to start naming names that if you want to continue these conversations with people? Because I was not a Canadian stripper, so
Yeah.
I don't have all the stories. I'm just fascinated, and I consider myself of a historian that wants to capture all of this.
Yeah. Name names.
You want to talk to Elena Downs,
Okay.
definitely. And
Uh-huh.
she's the founder of Pole Freaks, if you're familiar, or excuse me, Pole Junkies. She's the
Mm-hmm.
founder of Pole Junkies.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I don't know how far you want to start transitioning into the 2000s. And
Yeah, I feel like so I want to go into more of the 90s because some things
Mhm.
happened in
Okay.
a couple of things happened in 90s. So we're going to talk
Yeah.
about Fania a little bit and debunk the narrative that Fania was the first pole dance studio owner in the world. So and then we're going to touch on the early 2000s a little bit with Sheila Kelly. But I don't want to get too far into after Sheila Kelly because we've got some bombshells of information, and I'm trying to figure out if you and I do a part 2 or if this is the jumping off start of me finally putting together the footage that I have and adding new footage. So we're going to leave the audience on the edge of your seat a little bit
Okay.
wanting more. Yeah. So in 1994 was when Fania Mondi became a stripper in Canada, of all places. She's Canadian, which actually, now that we've
This,
really dove
she's
into the
from
history,
off the coast of Vancouver.
yeah, so that makes a lot of
Mhm.
sense. And Fania started dancing for a month in the club. She started around Halloween on her 19th birthday realm, and she danced for a month and started teaching strippers in the club. A month. I just think that's so soon. Anyways, and
Yeah, she
then
said she got her fireman spin and was like, I'm ready to go.
she got
We're
her
back,
fireman spin
yo.
and started teaching everybody else the fireman spin in the club. Then she only stripped for
a
several
year and a half.
months,
A year
a
and a
year
half
and a
she was a
half.
stripper. Yeah.
Right. Then she moved out of North America to an island.
Nassau.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah.
And now, Crimson, here's where I forget and I have to
That's
check
what
my
I
research. Did she open a
I'm here for
studio
you.
there? Thank you.
She did not open a studio in
Right.
Nassau. No.
So
She
go ahead, you
go
go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so with Fania, she started teaching in the clubs.
Hmm.
Like you said, it would have been in 94. And she started teaching out of a shoe store in 1998.
Right.
And that was also in Canada. And so and that was not just strippers, that was non-strippers and strippers. She said whoever wanted to learn.
Right.
She had her card out at a shoe store, and people who were, women went to buy, or whoever went to buy high heels. And if they saw the card and was like, oh, she would teach at this shoe store in 98. So that's interesting. She started teaching from her home. So that's a common theme that we're going to start seeing
Hmm.
in the late 90s and early 2000s, is
Hmm.
that a lot of strippers started teaching from their homes, and they were
Hmm.
teaching non-strippers from their homes.
Right.
And they
Pool
were
parties.
things like that, and individual lessons too.
Hmm.
And like, I know Fani was like, it was my nail lady, like my lady's nail. She just thought it was cool what I did. And they were still teaching in clubs, strippers. So the
Right.
strippers so they weren't just teaching in the clubs anymore, this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. People were starting to teach from home. Elena, who I was talking about, who I definitely think you need to talk to. She's really a major influence she started stripping in the late 80s in Calgary, in
Hmm.
Canada.
Uh-huh.
And she, to this day, owns 4 pole studios. She started Pole Junkies, which is like one of the first online pole communities. And she has her daughter and her grandson now part of her business. So,
Oh,
I mean,
amazing.
she brings such an amazing perspective. She traveled as a stripper in the early 90s. She'll have some great stories for you. But then Fania did not open. She moved to Vegas,
Right.
and she opened her studio there in 2005 out of a Pilates studio, and
Right.
then a second studio in 2008.
Right.
And so I will just jump in and say, in terms of pole studios opening, it's hard to tell because around this time, a lot of people were teaching pole, but they did not have a studio. They were either renting out space or they were teaching in their homes. I can tell you for sure the earliest that I have found is S Factor in LA in June 2003
Like for
opened.
an actual brick and mortar pole dance studio.
Correct. She was teaching in her home,
Right.
like a lot of people before, but she had gotten her brick and mortar in June 2003. Now, Tantra Fitness in Vancouver,
Right.
2004.
Okay.
Aradia Fitness, also out of Canada, that was actually started by two housewives. That's like the biggest pole franchise there is out there. They started in 2003, but they were renting out spaces. They did not have a physical space yet. Tantra was the first one in Canada to get their physical space.
Okay.
And that's Tammy Morris. And if
Yes.
y'all don't know Tammy Morris, she is an OG stripper, Vancouver again, and has amazing stories where she traveled around the world as a stripper. Again, her agent sent her all over, and then started partaking in the first like world pole dance championship. So she
Right.
in these world pole dance championships that started to emerge, it was not all, but it was mostly strippers that were partaking in them. And she is really Tammy Morris. I think you should talk to her too.
Okay.
She's great.
Yeah, I have connection with Tammy Morris. And yeah, I'd like to point
Yeah.
out that in 2005, there were 3 pole dance competitions around the world. There was World Pole Championships in the UK. There was Miss Pole Dance Australia, and
The World Pole Championship was in Amsterdam.
thank you. And then
Yeah.
there was
Miss
Miss
Pole
Pole
Dance
Dance
UK.
UK. That's what it
Yeah.
was. So it was Miss Pole Dance UK, Miss Pole Dance Australia, World Championships in Amsterdam. And in every single one of those, there were strippers in those.
Of
In fact,
course.
Miss Pole Dance Australia was completely produced by a stripper at the time, who then became a former stripper. And like you said, Tammy Morris was dancing on stage World Pole Championships in Amsterdam, along with Reiko, who's also a
Mhm.
super OG stripper. And they weren't the only two. There were a ton of strippers in that show.
Pantera was in that one.
Pantera was in that one, and she hails from Washington State. And then if you went to Miss Pole Dance Australia, Felix Kane, even though she wasn't in the 2005 show, she did stripping.
She was not a stripper.
She won stripper titles.
Yeah, she started pole dancing in 2006 and won Miss Pole Dance Australia in 2006.
She did stripping.
She started stripping after she started pole dancing then, because
Okay.
I have her story from an
Hmm.
interview, and I'm just saying this because I want everyone to respect everything that we're saying and know
Yeah,
that
absolutely. Yeah.
we did like the best research we can.
Yeah.
Felix was very young when she started pole dancing, and it was her mom and her sister went and took a pole dance class, and Felix was a trained ballerina.
Hmm.
And so she was like, and she's if you don't know Felix Kane, Roz the Diva said she's the Michael Jordan of pole dance. And I was
Yeah.
like, yes, Roz, that's pretty much Felix Kane.
Yeah.
But in 2006, her mom and her sister had taken a pole class in Perth, Australia. And
Hmm.
she said she was very uptight about it. And like, Mom, how could you take my little sister to
Right.
go do one of these pole dances class? And then she was like, well, my mom's doing this. Like, and her mom was like, oh, lighten up, come take a class with me. And so she did.
Yeah.
And she became instantly hooked, but she was not a stripper beforehand. She was actually training to be a ballerina.
Yeah. She
And
did do
so
it afterwards. She won
there we go.
titles. There's nude images of her on the
Oh
internet that I
yeah.
recall from back in the day. She
Yeah.
won like strip club champion titles from back in the day. Like,
She's amazing. She
yeah,
went from starting to winning the title within 8
everything.
months.
Yeah. So, but
She's
also
amazing.
Jamila, who was in who won the
She
first Miss
won
Pole Dance
2005.
Australia in 2005, which you cannot find on YouTube, but I have the DVD.
Ah,
Yeah, she did. And so I want to debunk a narrative about Jamila and the Jade split. So Pantera Blacksmith, as far as we know, is responsible for the introduction of the Jade split. Um, However,
the word jade stands for, it's JA, that stands for Jamila, and DE, that stands for DeVille. And it was named after Jamila, even though she did not invent it. And she actually, her and Bobby, who created Miss Pole Dance Australia, actually saw a video of Pantera doing the jade split. Pantera's video is very interesting because she was topless with nipple piercings and covered in tattoos.
She's badass.
So badass. And nobody had ever seen anything like this before. And she did this pole dance video where she just showed the pole tricks. She didn't explain them. And that's the video that Jamila and Bobby learned how to do a jade split from. And because she didn't explain it, and I have Bobby on record saying, like, we just had to keep trying it over and over and over again because we couldn't figure out how, like, because she wouldn't like teach it and say what it was. And so that's how Jamila learned the jade split. And because she did it on stage in front of a civilian audience, it brought the house down. And then the jade split was named after her, and she has been falsely credited, even though she herself does not take the credit. Jamila herself will not take ownership that she invented the jade split, but this is a narrative that has been put on her. Just like it's a narrative that has been put on Fania that she's the first pole dance instructor, and now we know that she's not. It started at least in the 80s, maybe earlier.
Oh, I'm sure
Right,
since the dawn of,
right.
strippers would probably teach other strippers,
Right.
right?
Of course. Yeah, because back then, it seems like they cared a little bit more about each other.
It's different, and I'm sure it was cutthroat back then too.
Sure.
But you
Okay.
find, we don't want to just say it was all this or it's all that, but it's just
Yeah.
interesting hearing these different um different stories from different people. So I think that, if you can speak to Elena, because she
I will.
really is hugely influential, because the fact of the matter is that pole did emerge from the strip clubs. If anyone who is believing the Chinese pole and the malakahab, they're just not, they just don't know better, but you can't, they just, that's just where they are. And you can try, all you can do is educate them, and if they're whatever, but we're here to just speak historical accuracy,
Yeah.
right? And so you said it best on my podcast. So for those who don't know, years ago, I used to have a podcast called the Pole Parlor Podcast, where I would interview different people from the pole community, and that was definitely inclusive of strippers. And so that's where a lot of this history comes from. And Anne Marie was an early on guest, and she said the best thing ever, which was, um, she said, Chinese and Indian men did not open our first studios. They did not start our first competitions, and they did not become our first instructors. Those were strippers, and that is 100% accurate. Now, non-strippers, of course, became interested and did their own work around it. And I would love to do another episode with you about like the 2000s, if
Yeah.
because we could go so much there, but
We could.
just ending,
I
if
think
we're
we
just
do.
ending,
Yeah, we do need to end here because if we get into the 2000s, we're going to keep
it's so
going. So we
much.
might have to do a part 2 on this. And before we do wrap up, I do want to acknowledge something that did happen in the early 2000s was we had in Los Angeles, uh, we had black strippers that were on the forefront of the pole dance industry here in Los Angeles, and their specific names. You have Natalie Clark, Angel Dust, and Josiah Grant, who were leading the way. You also had Expositions, which was one of 2 pole dance studios in Los Angeles. It actually was one of 3. But something that we'll get into in the next part is that S Factor always kept themselves separate from the pole dance industry. We didn't really consider them in the pole dance industry. Their community was more just separate. I don't want to use any other word. It was just separate. So Expositions it was black owned and black run, and I was their first white instructor actually. And they're also responsible for, because I worked with them for the first pole dance competition in the US outside of the strip club. And Josiah Grant, as a young Black man, was the first pole dance instructor to start traveling the world teaching and being sponsored by companies. And Angel Dust was also a Black pole dance event organizer, and she had her first competition, California Pole Dance Championship, in 2009. And Natalie Clark was an instructor and a supporter and a sponsor of all of these actions behind the scenes. So if it wasn't for those three specifically, and I'm sure there's more, so many things wouldn't have come to be in Los Angeles the way they did. And eventually, in true form, they got left out of the growth and narrative, not only because they were Black, but because they were strippers. And there was this period of time where strippers were shunned from the pole dance community. And then the civilian pole dancers took over the narrative and tried to wash out our history. And so we're here to unearth the truth, to tell you everything we know based on interviews, research, and firsthand knowledge of what we've seen and experienced. So again, if you have any information pertaining to anything here, I'm wondering what kind of response we're going to get. I really am wondering what kind of response we're going to get from this. Like, if you're going to tell us, like, no, you're wrong, actually this happened, please tell us we're wrong about something. Yeah.
Well, we're trying. So the point is that, yeah, I hope we were clear up front that we just presented to you the research that we found out there. And some of them, a lot of that research was research that you and I specifically did holding one-on-one interviews. So let's be clear about that.
Exactly.
A lot of it came from this book, Burlesque West, which is amazing. I have this prop here. This was one of the first pole dance DVDs. This was by a stripper. This was Fania in 1998.
Mm-hmm.
So we would love to hear, like, you know, plugging in the holes, because there's so much. And especially, oh my gosh, see, here's the thing. We just got up to about 2003, right?
Right.
2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, things explode.
Yeah.
Things explode. And so it's a lot harder to kind of hold the narrative there, because there's not one narrative, right? There's so many offshoots. There's so many people doing their own thing.
Right.
And so we're just trying to figure out, because here's the thing also, there was a bunch going on. I know that there were early pole studios in Japan and Hong Kong. We don't speak those languages, so there's probably the barrier there. And I know that there was a lot going on in Australia and the UK and perhaps in South America, but, you know, the research we have found so far, so we want to say that we know this is not inclusive, but the research that we're finding when we're looking for pole and is strippers in Vancouver is kind of where that really started.
Okay.
And much respect to all of those. And we can say that 3 people, Elena Downs, Tammy Morris, and Fania, were all emerged from that and who are known in the community. They're still around, still preaching. So
yeah.
And all strippers. So
awesome. Wow, this is great. I think we're gonna have to do this again. Thank you so much.
Oh, I would love to get into the so if anyone has any information, let's say up to like 2003, 4, let's hear it, because this is how there's nothing else written out there is what we're getting at. So don't try to be like Googling and finding. There's nothing else on the internet. We're creating the internet off of this.
Exactly.
So,
yes. Thank you so much. This is
and we want everyone's stories to be heard. So
absolutely.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here and talking with you, for allowing me to kind of share this research with everyone. I'm so grateful for you and for everyone for listening.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening, and stay tuned for more. I'm pretty sure. See you next week.
Bye.
That was awesome.
We're now accepting 4-for-1 submissions from our listeners. You can send them in via Instagram at YAS a Stripper Podcast or on Twitter at YAS a Stripper Pod. Make sure to follow all the things and email any questions or concerns to YAS a Stripper Podcast at gmail.com. Tune in every Wednesday. See you soon.